Hello. You are listening to an episode of Trade Talks, a podcast about the economics of trade policy. I'm Chad Bown, a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics in Washington. This week, Soumaya, Keynes and I have a four-part conversation about trade deals with Professor Dani Rodrik. Dani Rodrik is the Ford Foundation Professor of International Political Economy at Harvard University. Here's part two of our conversation.
Let's talk about possible ways to improve trade deals. So one of the things that you've mentioned is this idea that trade deals should address social dumping. Could you explain that?
Social dumping refers to the kind of trade that might undermine pre-existing social bargains, whether it's environmental rules or labor standards in the importing countries. And the analog is with sort of the other kind of dumping, which is in the international trade rules. That if a country is exporting to your market below cost, then you have a remedy. And the remedy is you can put an anti-dumping duty on those exporters. Now, there's no economic rationale for anti-dumping in the existing regime. Strictly from an economic standpoint, it doesn't make sense. I think the rationale which justifies, and by and large appropriate rationale, is that that increases the sense of fairness. So every market is embedded in a certain set of rules of fair game. That is, that we don't throw people into sort of wild competition without any rules, and those rules are about fairness. That in the domestic competition, it means that that you compete with others that had access to the same ground rules as you did, and that you don't have an unlevel playing field, that somebody doesn't get a subsidy or is not allowed to violate domestic labor standards and therefore become a stronger competitor against you. Everybody's operating under the same ground rules. And again, it's something that economists don't think about too much, but I think the justifiable sense in which anti-dumping belongs in the international trade regime is that if for whatever reason some companies are able to sell to your market at below cost, either because they have big pockets or because they have access to patient capital because their financial system is different, or because they are being in one way or another financed by their governments implicitly, that's not a fair competition, that this should be outside the rules. And I think the social dumping analog is exactly the same, but in the social domain. That is, that the idea would be that it's unfair to tell our workers that, for example, that they should compete with workers in other nations where their rights to bargain, their safety conditions in the factory are violated to such an extent that foreign companies are able to get a competitive edge vis-a-vis our own. And effectively, therefore, such competition is a way of telling our workers, either you reduce your own standards and become ready to work more like under their standards, or else you're going to lose your job. And I think that kind of unfair competition is what is still not in the rules. There are no rules against such unfair competition. And I think that's why I think that it's kind of a social dumping analog to regular anti-dumping. I think makes sense and I think belongs in the rules.
So I suppose if you were trying to apply that in practice, then you would inevitably end up writing in labour standards to trade deals.
No.
No?
No.
Because wouldn't you have to write down the circumstances that everyone would have to adhere to, and then if they didn't adhere to those, then you could put... No? No,
you would write down the procedural standards in the international rules. That is, that the international rules would contain procedural safeguards against pure protectionism. So therefore, the international rules would specify, loosely speaking, the kind of domestic administrative procedure that has to take place in order to ensure that the result is not protectionist, but a legitimate or justifiable protection against social dumping.
But so when you define social dumping, like you define it relative to some standard?
Yeah, but I think that standard has got to be national. It cannot be international. So let me back up here again, because I think this brings up an important area where, in fact, I differ from a lot of my sort of progressive friends and who think about trade issues. I think a lot of people who look at these problems of regulatory arbitrage and social dumping and worry about differences in labor standards across countries and so forth, their approach is to say, let's either as part of trade agreements or more generally, let's try to upgrade social standards globally. So in the context of the TPP, for example, there was an attempt to negotiate higher labor standards or have some ways in which to ensure that labor standards would be upgraded in Vietnam, for example. Now, I'm not necessarily against that, but I think that because that we're only at the very beginning of that process, and B, because I'm sort of skeptical about the efficacy of international agreements on labor standards. I think it's my preferred procedure would be one that at the very least complements any international effort and therefore gives domestic countries domestic paths, this is domestic remedies. So in my preferred approach, social dumping would be administered domestically, and it would be a domestic process. And therefore, when you ask the question, what would be the measure of social dumping? It would be, again, let me give you an analogy. When we keep goods out that do not satisfy our domestic lead standards for toys, the relevant standard is the national one. We say that we set a domestic lead content standard, and we keep goods out that do not satisfy it. So I think there's got to be an analog domestically, which can only be arrived at through deliberation and discussion, and it may take some time, is that there has to be some domestic discussion about what kind of goods produced under what kind of ways are really unacceptable in terms of competition. It's easy to define two ends. On the one hand, it's easy to say that any good that comes in because the workers were earning less, simply because the workers were earning less than domestic workers, that wouldn't satisfy the social dumping requirement, because you might say, look, they might be earning less because their productivity is less. So that on its own would not be ground for ruling that there is social dumping. At the very other end, goods made by slave labor, for example, that would clearly be a case where, in fact, existing trade rules already keep out prison labor. So this is like prison labor is not subject to the usual trade rules because of the argument that that's an illegitimate form of production to enter international trade. Slave trade, of course, goods made with slave labor, of course, would be an even more extreme case of that. So that's another case where, in fact, at least with respect to prison labor, we've already defined, and that's actually an international definition, we've defined internationally that that's unfair competition. The middle part, I think, is up for grabs. And I think what I would like to see is, in fact, two things. One is a multilaterally negotiated set of procedural safeguards in terms of how that process domestically should be. So that international agreement, for example, must specify the transparency of the process, that the process must be open to all the stakeholders, what kind of questions must that process actually answer, but that substantively, that process must take place domestically, where effectively, if a domestic group, let's say a labor union or a set of producers, are arguing against letting imports come in on the basis of social dumping, they have to make a positive case that these imports are undermining existing norms of employer-employee relationships that are embedded in our current regulations and our standards. And groups on the other side, which benefit from these imports, would then have to make the argument that that is not the case. Now, if it is slave labor or prison labor, you can easily see how it would be very difficult for a group that would benefit from this trade to actually in a public domain make the argument, yeah, we still benefits. There's still the gains from trade. There's still the Harburger triangles. Let's let these goods in. In other cases, it's going to be very hard. But I think there's no way that we can evade this question in a world that's so tightly integrated and where countries are competing and the jurisdictional boundaries ensure that sort of countries are coming into exchange with each other with very, very different sets of rules and ground rules. And I think, we are only at the very beginning of this. But if we don't confront this issue head on as to how we actually increase the legitimacy and the perceived fairness of this trade, and have it enable this discussion rather than shove it under the rug, it only becomes a bigger issue. And I'll tell you exactly how it becomes a bigger issue. It becomes a bigger issue because you get somebody like Donald Trump coming and then using the unfair trade argument and tarring the 85% of trade with this, as opposed to potentially maybe only the 5% that might be really where it might be an issue.
Let's talk a little bit about that old TPP deal and what may end up being proposed in this new NAFTA, because to me it sounds like a lot of the elements that you're interested in having were there. So the United States pushed for including the kind of 4 basic ILO provisions on labor standards. So the right to collectively bargain, not discriminate. You have to have a minimum wage. You don't have to have my minimum wage, but you have to have a minimum wage. Those kinds of basic standards were going to be part of the deal that Vietnam would have to take on. And then ultimately it was going to be enforceable. So it wouldn't necessarily have been enforceable in the same way that an anti-dumping case would have been, whereas a domestic firm could have just lobbied the Commerce Department or filed a case. It would have to go through a formal trade dispute. So the labor union or an American company would have had to first convince the American government to file a case against Vietnam, and then it would have been adjudicated under the TPP tribunal. But is that a step in the right direction as you see it, or is that not going to how you think this issue of social dumping should be addressed?
I think it's a small step in the right direction. I think it's much better than the side agreement on labor in NAFTA, and much better than which was in turn better than what was there before. I'm all for it, and I'm happy to see that there's more thinking going on along these lines. But what I didn't like about the TPP is that there are many other things that go in the other direction, and I just fundamentally thought that this was not the right thing for the U.S. administration to be wasting political capital on. Now, of course, I sort of see and understand what happened here, that this was largely a deal that captured the imagination of the U.S. Foreign policy community because of its geopolitical angle, which is what can we do for Asia beyond our military commitment, and what way can we do something that will, not to put too fine print on it, isolate China. And I think this was the solution that the U.S. foreign policy community came up with. Once you had this idea, then I think you had all these, especially pharmaceuticals and many other private interests sort of put in their own sort of special things into it. And then so you got something that really wasn't economically a very big deal for the United States at all. It's tiny. Came at a very large political cost, as we saw during the election. And I think from the perspective of the developing countries or other countries in the agreement, I think created some precedents that were largely negative. Even though I think that if Vietnam were to live up to those labor commitments, I think on the whole it would be a good thing. But that wasn't the only thing. And as I said, I think earlier, I'm a little bit skeptical. If you read about the procedures with the sort of the labor agreement, how long it was going to take, and so I'm not, it's not like ISDS, it's not the kind of assurance that it provides to investors about how sort of getting their way. So in the end, I don't think it's a very particularly effective way. And I think if we're going to talk about improving labor standards, I don't want that discussion to be taking place in the context of trade agreements. I don't want trade negotiators to be carrying that discussion. I think that subverts the purpose. So again, going back to your question, was on balance, was that labor provision on balance a good thing? I think so, yes. But I think on the big picture, I think the whole strategy was wrong, and I think it backfired.
I guess my issue with the labour standards thing is that I agree a debate would be really good. It would be great to have these discussions. Where on the spectrum should we be? And even if it is done domestically, then still fundamentally someone in, say, the US will end up deciding whether imports from, say, Mexico should be blocked based on a judgment that US judge has made on what the labour standards in Mexico should be. And supposing you're a company or you're a worker in Mexico who's being hit by that, or you might feel that someone else has made a judgment on your rules, and those rules should be, yours to change. So I understand the point about procedures, but it still feels like there's this worry that someone else is making a decision on your laws for you.
No. So this, again, it's important to clarify that the point of international negotiations on labor standards is to raise other countries' labor standards. The point of my social dumping procedure is to protect our domestic workers from low labor standards or low social standards in other countries. There's a difference. In practice, that difference might be clouded, but there's a difference between doing something because you want to uphold your own standards versus doing something because you want to make other countries look more like you. So the social dumping is really not meant to say first of all, it wouldn't be all Mexican exports. It would be particular item being imported from a particular source, which is subject to, let's say, exploitative labor conditions. And then the procedure would be, is this something that is essentially telling our workers that they need to, that they would undermine their labor standards. And in that case, we would not be, we as the United States, we're not telling the Mexican producer necessarily that you have to change your labor standards. We're just saying that, we don't have to accept these imports. Now, in practice, that might tell the Mexican producers that the cost of maintaining exploitative labor practices have gone up, because now you cannot export these things. But I do think it's very important in the international economy as a whole to uphold the principle that countries have the right to uphold the integrity of their regulatory regimes and their standards. And that's okay. But it is not okay to extend those standards to other countries, to tell other countries what is it that they ought to be doing. And I think that's an important principle as a principle. Although, of course, as I you might say, if an important country does something that is going to increase the cost of having low standards in another country, that's the other country might then decide that it has no choice to improve its standards as well. But I think that distinction is an important one in practice.
That's the end of part 2 of our 4-part conversation with Dani Rodrik. Thanks to Dani Rodrik, and thanks also to the Julis Rabinowitz Center for Public Policy and Finance at Princeton University's Woodrow Wilson School. Thanks to them for hosting a conference that brought the three of us together. And thanks, as always, to our listeners. Please do keep in touch. On Twitter, I'm @ChadBown.
And we're on @trade__talks.
That's not one, but 2 underscores, @trade__talks. Because even a 2-part episode with Dani Rodrik just wasn't enough.